Chrysler built an engine in 1951 that was so dominant, NASCAR banned it twice. Then the NHRA restricted it. Then insurance companies refused to cover it. And 70 years later, it's still the most feared engine ever bolted into an American car. This is the evolution of the Hemi, the engine that wouldn't die no matter how many times they tried to kill it. The hemispherical combustion chamber wasn't Chrysler's invention. European manufacturers had been using the design since the 1920s because the physics were simple. A dome-shaped chamber with the valves positioned opposite each other created better airflow, higher compression, and more complete fuel combustion than a conventional wedge-head engine. Chrysler's engineers knew all this when they started development in 1948. What they didn't know was that they were about to create the most controversial power plant in American automotive history. The first-generation Hemi debuted in 1951 as the Firepower V8, a 331 cubic inch monster making 180 horsepower. That doesn't sound impressive now, but in 1951, most V8s were pushing maybe 135 horses on a good day. Chrysler had just dropped a 45 horsepower advantage on the entire industry, and nobody saw it coming. The design was brilliant in its simplicity. By placing the valves in a hemispherical chamber instead of inline, Chrysler could run larger valves with less restriction. The spark plug sat right in the center of the chamber, igniting the fuel mixture from the optimal position for complete combustion. The downside? The engine was massive, heavy, and hideously expensive to manufacture. Each head required 2 rocker shafts instead of 1. The valve train was complicated, and the whole assembly took up more space under the hood than any other engine design. Chrysler didn't care about the cost. They cared about winning races. The Hemi first showed up at NASCAR in 1955, running in the Chrysler 300. Tim Flock won the championship that year with 18 victories, and Carl Kiekhaefer's Chrysler team absolutely dominated the competition. It wasn't even close. The Hemi-powered 300s were so far ahead of the field that by mid-season, other manufacturers started complaining to NASCAR that the engine was unfair. NASCAR's response? They didn't ban the Hemi. They just made the rules so restrictive that running one became economically impossible. By 1958, Chrysler pulled out of racing entirely, and the first-generation Hemi quietly disappeared from production. The engine was too expensive to build for street cars, and without racing to justify the costs, Chrysler went back to conventional wedgehead engines. But here's the thing about the Hemi. Once you've built the most powerful engine in America, you can't just walk away from it. The engineering team at Chrysler spent the entire early 1960s watching Ford and Chevrolet dominate NASCAR and drag racing with their big block engines, and they knew they had the answer sitting in the archives. All they needed was an excuse to bring it back. That excuse arrived in 1964 when Ford dropped the 427 SOHC engine, the infamous Cammer, that was making over 600 horsepower in race trim. Chrysler's response was to dust off the Hemi blueprints and build something even more insane. The second-generation 426 Hemi debuted at the 1964 Daytona 500, and it made the Ford look like a lawnmower engine. Richard Petty won the Daytona 500 with a Hemi. Then he won the next race, and the next one. Chrysler-powered cars won the first 8 races of the 1964 NASCAR season. By race 9, Ford and General Motors had both filed formal complaints with NASCAR, claiming the Hemi was a race-only engine that violated the stock car rules. They were right. Chrysler hadn't actually built a street version yet. They'd just shown up to Daytona with a pure racing engine and dared NASCAR to do something about it. NASCAR banned the Hemi for the 1965 season. Chrysler's response was perfect. They pulled every single factory-backed team out of NASCAR, left Ford and GM to race against each other in empty grandstands, and started selling street-legal 426 Hemis to the public. If NASCAR wanted proof the engine was production-based, Chrysler would give them all the proof they needed. The 1966 Street Hemi hit dealerships with 425 advertised horsepower, but every single person who's ever dyno tested one knows that number is complete fiction. Real-world tests showed these engines making anywhere from 465 to 485 horsepower at the flywheel, with some dyno sheets hitting over 500 horses in completely stock trim. Chrysler had underrated the engine by at least 50 horsepower to keep insurance companies and the government from losing their minds. The problem? The street Hemi was an absolute nightmare to own. It required constant valve adjustments, drank fuel like it was going out of style, needed premium gas that cost twice as much as regular, and idled so roughly that it shook the fillings out of your teeth. Chrysler recommended valve lash adjustments every 5,000 miles, but most owners needed to adjust them every 2,000 just to keep the engine running properly. The solid lifter setup meant the engine sounded like a bucket of bolts at idle, and it didn't really wake up until you hit 3,000 RPM. But when you did hit 3,000 RPM, nothing on the street could touch you. The Hemi would pull hard all the way to 6,000 RPM and beyond, making power in ranges where other engines had already given up. Guys who owned Hemi Cudas and Chargers didn't care about the maintenance hassles because they were too busy collecting pink slips at stoplights. NASCAR had to let the Hemi back in for 1966 because Chrysler had met their homologation requirements. Richard Petty immediately won Daytona again. David Pearson won the championship. Dodge and Plymouth teams took turns dominating every super speedway race on the schedule. Ford and Chevrolet teams spent the entire season complaining to NASCAR that the Hemi was still too powerful and needed to be restricted. So NASCAR did what sanctioning bodies always do when one manufacturer gets too dominant. They started changing the rules to slow it down. Restrictor plates appeared at certain tracks. Minimum weight requirements went up for Hemi-powered cars. Aerodynamic modifications were banned. Every time Chrysler figured out how to work around a rule change, NASCAR would add another restriction. The NHRA had similar problems. Hemi-powered cars were breaking track records so frequently that the sanctioning body had to create entirely new classes just to separate the Hemis from everything else. Don Garlits, Sox and Martin, Ronnie Sox, every major drag racer who switched to a Hemi immediately started dominating their class. The engine was so powerful that it forced the NHRA to completely restructure their rulebook. Then 1970 happened, and the muscle car era started its rapid collapse. Insurance companies had finally figured out that Hemi-powered cars were hospitalizing people at an alarming rate. A 20-year-old kid trying to insure a Hemi Cuda in 1970 was looking at annual premiums of $5,000 or $6,000, more than the car itself cost. Suddenly, an engine that made you the king of the street also made you completely uninsurable. The government piled on with emissions regulations that the Hemi couldn't meet without strangling its performance. The solid lifter setup, radical cam timing, and high compression ratios that made the engine so powerful also made it impossible to comply with 1971 Clean Air Act standards. Chrysler tried detuning the Hemi, dropping compression, adding emissions equipment, but every change just made the engine more expensive and less powerful. The final street Hemi rolled off the assembly line in 1971. Total production across all Hemi-powered models from 1966 to 1971, roughly 11,000 engines. Chrysler had built one of the most dominant performance engines in history, and almost nobody bought one because the insurance companies made it financially impossible. For 30 years, the Hemi name disappeared from Chrysler's lineup. They built good engines during that time. The 340, the 360, even the turbocharged 2.2-liter four-cylinder that powered the GLH, but none of them had the Hemi's legendary status. The name became mythical. Guys who'd never even seen a real 426 Hemi in person would argue for hours about how it was the greatest engine ever built. The scarcity only enhanced the legend. Then, in 2003, Chrysler did something nobody expected. They brought the Hemi back. The third-generation Hemi was nothing like its predecessor. Modern computer-controlled fuel injection instead of carburetors, variable valve timing instead of solid lifters, aluminum heads instead of cast iron. The 5.7-liter version made 345 horsepower, which sounds impressive until you remember the original street Hemi was making 500 real horsepower back in 1966. Muscle car purists absolutely lost their minds. But here's what the purists missed. Chrysler wasn't trying to recreate the 426. They were trying to build an engine that captured the Hemi's spirit while actually being reliable enough for normal people to own. The new Hemi showed up in Ram trucks, Dodge Chargers, Chrysler 300s, vehicles that people actually drove every day. It didn't require valve adjustments every 2,000 miles. It didn't shake itself apart at idle. It ran on regular pump gas and got decent fuel economy. And when you wanted to make serious power, the modern Hemi responded just like its grandfather. Bolt on a supercharger and suddenly that 345 horsepower jumped to 707 in the Hellcat. Add more boost, better internals, and you hit 840 horses in the Demon. Chrysler had proven you could build a Hemi that your grandmother could drive to church and that would also run 9-second quarter miles with street tires. The racing world noticed. NASCAR teams switched to Hemi-powered Dodges and immediately started winning races. Funny car teams dropped Hemis into dragsters and reset track records. The engine that NASCAR had banned in 1965 came back 50 years later and started dominating all over again. Production of the third-generation Hemi ended in 2024 after 21 years of continuous production. Chrysler built millions of them, more than all previous Hemi generations combined. They powered everything from half-ton trucks to 1,000-horsepower drag cars. The engine went out the same way it came in, as the most powerful, most controversial, most talked-about power plant in American automotive history. But here's what makes the Hemi story different from every other muscle car engine. The Pontiac 455 is gone. The Chevrolet LS6 is gone. The Ford Boss 429 is gone. Those engines had their moment, burned bright, and disappeared. The Hemi has survived for 70 years across 3 completely different generations because Chrysler understood something fundamental. The Hemi was never just an engine. It was an idea. The idea that if you build something powerful enough, controversial enough, and dominant enough, people will remember it long after the last one rolls off the assembly line. NASCAR banned it twice and it came back stronger. The NHRA restricted it and it still won championships. Insurance companies tried to kill it and it survived. The government regulated it out of existence, and Chrysler brought it back 30 years later. Every time someone tried to stop the Hemi, it just reinforced the legend. That's the evolution of the Hemi. 70 years of building the most powerful engine possible, getting banned for being too good, and coming back even stronger. Some engines win races, some engines sell cars. The Hemi did both while simultaneously terrifying sanctioning bodies, insurance companies, and anyone foolish enough to line up next to one at a stoplight. The Hemi wasn't just the king of engines, it was the engine that proved kings don't need permission.